I wonder if it's live. It probably is, but I check every time. So today we are actually, I guess I should probably check before I do the intro. Let's see. 3. My internet is so slow. That kills me. Though I am not as dead as whatever Pantheon is, which we will discuss soon. How does it not show this? This should actually be live. Madness. Yay, it is. Cool. Now, introduction. Who killed Pantheon? The classic PNW whodunit. There are many unsolved mysteries in politics and war, but this is one of the more infamous ones because you can talk to hundreds of different players and have hundreds of different answers because so many people were involved. However, Pantheon was a relatively well-known alliance in like 2016 to 2020. Like it's been gone a long time now. I did not announce that I went online. That is a good point. I've completely forgot to do that, and I said I would actually do that. In total fairness, though, I don't expect any Americans to be awake, and that is like a not insignificant part of the entire PNW player base. So I will do one ping. This is annoying to get through. I've interrupted my intro monologue to try and find the links. Okay. Good. And copy a link. There, done. Yay. Cool. Yeah, good job to you. Also good job to me for actually doing it. So yes, Pantheon was a well-known alliance a long time ago. It is not so well-known now, to the disappointment of many, especially in the Immortals, who have a lot of members from there, and probably from the Syndicate, who was also quite close with Pantheon. But anyway, so Pantheon was basically a large farming alliance. They weren't a warlike alliance. And they formed in 2016. They disbanded in 2020 after, and it says it on the page, due to a series of coups. It wasn't one coup, it wasn't two coups, it was a series of coups. And so you have a series of different possible, I don't want to say murderers, but candidates for this whodunit, right? Who killed Pantheon? Who put the final nail in its coffin? So you have the Emperor, the Founder, who missed a blitz. You have Akuro, who stole a bank and deleted the Discord. You have Yui, who merged it. Ridcully, Roar, Tyrion, Six, Dusty, myself, George, Inst, TS, lots of different candidates, and we're going to go through each of them and weigh up if they're responsible and how responsible they are. Because I don't want to spoil what my view is, but all of them did play a part in this. There were a lot of nails in that coffin. At least until we get to the final one, it'll be a very entertaining video. And to complement it is one of the only good posts on the wiki. And I'm not going to read it all. I've made that mistake before. But it is an amazing post, and it's done by Fist, who is the founder of Pantheon and one of the more controversial players in the game. So in short, to summarize a lot of this stuff, he was a member of the GPA, the Green Protection Agency, which was this large, very neutral, pacifist alliance. They really didn't fight offensive wars for any reason. And so he brought a bunch of those people over into PNW and started a protectorate of the Syndicate, under the Syndicate. And he's remained close to the Syndicate, I think, forevermore. I think he's still close with them. though less so now. Yeah, so they rapidly grew because all neutral alliances do, somehow, but especially in the early days, because the major powers like Rose and the Syndicate were constantly fighting, and GPA and others weren't. Their biggest problems were pirates and potential hegemons. So yeah, so he's basically talking about a bunch of like Pantheon's goals, and he talks about one of them being like rolling MPO out of the game. Although that is a huge part of his motivation, it didn't play a huge role in Pantheon's history, funnily enough. So going through a lot of this stuff, here we go. So this is the decisive moment. You can sort of picture him as this almighty founder figure. Like he portrays himself as like the emperor from Warhammer 40k, and that is sort of accurate to how he was in the Alliance. He was a very charismatic leader, and he built the Alliance up, and it had a lot going for it. It was at its peak. Yep, they were number one in score, and in wealth, they were extremely rich, richer than the Syndicate. Even the Syndicate, this famous economic alliance, and one of the paramount military powers of the day, had to come to them and ask for money. So that is how rich and how powerful Pantheon was. And then, in their first real major war, he overslept, and he was the only one with the war plans. And so because of that, they immediately lost the war to mercenaries, and I think he quit. He basically tore the Alliance apart because they were deprived of their founder and of all of this momentum and vision which had led them that far. And instead, a new leader came up, and that was Yui. But that's the initial like introduction to the Emperor. That is him oversleeping. Is that enough to like say that he destroyed the Alliance at its peak? Because it never did reach that point again. Maybe. Some would say so. I think, yeah, he definitely feels guilty over it. However, the Alliance continued on, right? And I would say that the real tragedy wasn't him oversleeping, it was him quitting after that. Because if he'd stuck around and tried to remedy his mistake, I think it would have gone a lot better. So he played a part, but he's probably not the one that did it. At least, not right now. So then Yui takes over. And Yui leads the Alliance for quite a while, relatively successfully. Until, and this isn't really mentioned here, I don't think, a high government member of Pantheon coups the Alliance, steals its bank, and steals, or destroys the Discord, deletes all the channels, all the important parts. And this shatters the Alliance, and they also leak all their documents and a bunch of high gov stuff. So it destroys them internally, externally. The Alliance was never weaker, irrespective of its score and numbers. And that started this snowball of just bad things happening to the Alliance, and the members perceiving it as cursed. So some people point to that and say, well, Akura is the one that destroyed Pantheon. And there are still remnants, funnily enough, of the Pantheon bank, of what was stolen, carrying on in the game right now. Because that stolen money was reinvested and spent, and in other ways it still continues to have an effect on the game. It didn't evaporate. So some people would say they destroyed the Alliance. But really, all the members were still there. Right? They didn't actually lose that much. They could have rebuilt. That perception of it being cursed was it was a figment of their imagination, and that was something the other leaders could have probably addressed. So then you have the next candidate, which is Yui, right? Because she didn't address those issues, at least not comprehensively. She was not able to stave off the disaster that they perceived to be incoming, and so she decided to merge the Alliance with the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth was the successor to the Green Protection Agency. And so spiritually, ancestrally, then Pantheon and GPA came from the same roots. The Commonwealth and Pantheon came from the same roots, which was GPA. And so that merger was a very natural progression. So maybe Yui destroyed the alliance ultimately. But I think Yui and those members would argue that was that it was a continuation, that the Commonwealth would have been a continuation of Pantheon. But for another candidate, Ridcully, who I think is actually in this at some point. Let's find him. Here it is. So Yui resigned as Titan, and then they joined TCW. Don Juan left and joined Grumpy, but most of the members joined TCW following Yui and that merger. And Ridcully became the fourth Titan. So, in short, Ridcully vetoed the decision to merge by using some weird charter clause, I think, or he may have just cooed the alliance and said, "No, we're not going to disband." And half the members stayed with him, particularly smaller members. This split the alliance forevermore, and so I think a lot of people from the Commonwealth and those sorts of Pantheon members would say, well, Ridcully destroyed the alliance because he was the one that prevented it like really continuing and being a major power in the top 5. Because TCW, I think, fell into like top 10. They weren't quite as strong as Pantheon was. And Pantheon itself fell into like the bottom 30 and never recovered. Like its grandeur of being like rank 1 or rank 5. It got close, but it never did accomplish that again. So some people would say it was Ridcully that finally did it. Another option actually comes after the Emperor has his return and path of revenge. So Ridcully hands the alliance back to the Emperor, who returns in spontaneous and fantastic fashion. I think coming out of TKR or one of these other alliances where he was just sort of chilling and being non-existent. But yeah, he comes back and he leads Pantheon in a glorious campaign across the stars in this theme of the Emperor. And he builds them up to 150 members with all these new recruitment strategies. And he fixes their economy, and he gains all this momentum that Pantheon isn't cursed and it will survive. And he wins a global war against the Knights Radiant, called Nightfall, and I'll pull that up because it's kind of cool. And this war was amazing for a few reasons, but for the big one for Pantheon was that Pantheon entered this war perceiving itself to be a great power again. So that was already a huge change in mentality. They only fought the Protectorates, sure, but they were in the winning coalition, and they had defeated the largest and most powerful alliances of the day. TKR, who'd held rank 1 for almost 2 years. The Commonwealth, those, in their view, traitors that had run off. Guardian, this military power from the game's heyday of 2014. At least in their view. Grumpy, the largest whale alliance, or one of them in the day. And at the time, like TKR, TCW, Guardian, a lot of these groups were perceived to be unbeatable because they had so many large nations. And so this really did change Pantheon's mentality in a huge way. And it seemed like their best days were ahead of them. And then he started to chill. He relaxed a bit. There was a bunch of drama or whatever. This is talking about the merger and all the disputes. And some stuff about, during Nightfall, Pantheon reached number 2. That was their all-time peak. But keep in mind that was because like TKR had lost score and stuff like that. But it's still amazing. Truly amazing. But yeah, so after that though, he quit. He resigned from the alliance. And I could say, well, maybe this is another example where he might be the one to sort of put the nail in the coffin, because when he resigned, he also sort of, the alliance's momentum ground to a halt. But I would not put that down to him. It's why I don't consider him as having tried to destroy it or being a cause of its destruction at this point. I would say in the early point, where he quit over the Blitz, sure. And even he would point that out. But at this point, I would disagree because he was handing it off to Kata Shimon or whatever, Roar, who was a syndicate person who was very close to, who should have had the skills and the knowledge and the momentum to keep the alliance going. But for whatever reason, they weren't able to. So that's another candidate for who destroyed it. But before we get to Raw, we also have to talk about the Meliage coup. So right into Raw's leadership, then the second in command, I think, and a few High Gov members couped the alliance and tried to have it defect to the Syndicate's number one enemy at the time, which was the Black Knights, and to make Pantheon basically a protectorate. So in a few months, from January to March, then Pantheon went from number 2, having bounced back in spontaneous faction, with this great leader at their helm, to what is going to become a giant protectorate of their former enemies. Not great, very difficult challenge. But Meliage, the person who did it, VM'd. And this allowed Raw to take over the alliance again by using like admins and rules and stuff like that. Unfortunately, though, again, following all of that chaos, then the Syndicate cancelled Pantheon. And I put Syndicate later as like one of the possible sort of candidates as well, because Syndicate didn't cancel Pantheon once. It cancelled Pantheon twice. It cancelled them earlier when they were really powerful under the Emperor, and then it cancelled them twice when he'd recently left, and they just underwent this coup, or the failed coup. So both times I think Syndicate abandoned them at key points when it could have really helped them. And supposedly I think then Syndicate also paid Terminus S, the mercenaries, to launch those attacks on Pantheon, which, you know, the one where he missed the Blitz, right? So the Syndicate played this more subtle role that they didn't help, or they hindered them at certain points. So maybe, in some people's view, I think in his view almost, at certain points, the Syndicate did, you know, add a nail to the coffin. They might not have put the final nail there, but they did do a lot. And in a lot of more average members' views, they view Syndicate as doing it because they think that the Syndicate Protectorate or treaty or whatever was the only thing keeping Pantheon alive. That was their only lifeline, and that when it was cut, Pantheon became paperless and was totally isolated and had lost all of its momentum and options. And that also led to a mass exodus of the larger players who could not defend themselves in an isolated alliance. Wales particularly need spheres to defend them. So that's an interesting component. But Raw leads the alliance for a while, and it's from May 4th they were at 200,000 score, 220,000, and then by May 13th they were at 81,000. So they lost half their score in basically a week. Although that was a month after the Protectorate ended. Oh wait, yeah, I forgot. The Pantheon preemptively declaring war. This is another interesting one where I would say that Raw's decision here wasn't necessarily something that destroyed the alliance, even though it did lead to this like catastrophic effect on the alliance, where when they were cancelled by the Syndicate, Nova Riata and the Federation, two alliances they'd fought in Nightfall, that huge global war, they took revenge and they hit the alliance. They were going to hit the alliance, and Pantheon was alerted of this and struck first. And so, in my view, that isn't really on Raw. It was under her tenure, sure, but she could not have prevented the Syndicate from cancelling them necessarily, even though she was very close to the Syndicate. And like they would have been hit regardless. So yeah, I would not put that on them because it wasn't their real decision, right? They preempted it. Yeah, so they fight this war and they lose a lot of members. And during that conflict, at some point, I think Raw basically like resigns and hands the alliance off to Six. And if you ask most of the Pantheon people, like they don't like Raw that much, but they don't find Raw's greatest sin to be losing the TS treaty. They don't find it to be fighting the war, which in a way they almost won. Um, and they don't view it as like any of the small changes they made. They view it as handing the alliance off to Six, who ultimately makes it sort of a dictatorship. Um, yeah, so he removes a bunch of like their gov. He bans Rid Cully, and he makes it a 100% tax alliance, which was totally against the ethos of the old Pantheon. And yeah, he changes the Discord and a bunch of other stuff. And so a lot of people would say Pantheon ended with Six, because the Pantheon of Six was totally unrecognizable from the Pantheon of any of the other leaders, and that there was not really the same continuation of leadership. Because Rid Cully and the Emperor and those people who added legitimacy to the alliance had absolutely no role in Six's leadership, or openly abhorred it. But yeah, so let's go back to the list. Oh, I forgot to mention Tyrion. So Tyrion's more of a subtle character as well, but I do think to mention him because he was a leader, I think, under, or not a leader, he was high government of IA under the Emperor and or Raw. And he was, I think he was responsible in part for how fast the alliance grew. I don't think it was all his strategy, I think it was more of the Emperor's strategy, but he learned those skills. And when the Emperor left, if he'd stood up there and stuck with them, they could have maintained their numbers and continued to become a greater power. But at some point under the leadership, he left and founded a little known alliance called the Immortals, which is very, very similar to Pantheon. Pantheon is based on like the Greek Pantheon. The Immortals is based on the Egyptian Pantheon, right? You have the Egyptian Ankh on the flag, and even though it's based on like the Immortals as like Persia, I think it has Celestials and this other stuff, which is more vaguely just like it's a vaguer sort of religious thing of mythology. So he was competing with Pantheon in the same sort of space for members, right? It would be the same as like there being an alliance called Rose and there being an alliance called like Tulip. They're very, very similar. Or having like Knights Templar and Knights Radiant, right? It's that same sort of thing. So a lot of the Pantheon people were like, that shouldn't have happened. And the members that left Pantheon and joined him, that was also really bad. Or that he took the skills that the Emperor had bestowed upon him, and then that deprived the alliance of what it needed to continue. So there's some people that blame him, but I think that's sort of misguided. Yeah, because there were so many other people that played much, much, much bigger roles, and he's very much a side character, at least in this story. So yeah, moving on though. Six Sadistic takes over. The Alliance hangs at about 100,000 score, and people believe that it will never move from there, that it will just stay at 100k score, that it's mostly his friends, and there is some like really funny rumors about his leadership, which I won't go into, but you can find them in the game. It's very entertaining. So some people blame him because they believe he's going to stagnate the Alliance, but some people also believe, well, he was one of the only leaders of Pantheon that couldn't be responsible because he was never going to actually destroy it. That it would have just remained basically a tax farm, and it would have survived. Technically, it would have survived forever if no one had interfered. So that's a really fun one too. But yeah, so he's running it with like 50 people, 100,000 score, chilling. Most of them are his friends and stuff. And Dusty, who is, how do we put it, chaotic, evil, I guess, neutral, something, anyway. He's a chaotic figure who joins alliances, sometimes coups them, steals banks, but also develops alliances. You can basically flip a coin and he'll have helped an alliance reach its potential, or helped it reach its potential and then destroyed it in rapid succession. So he joins Pantheon and he radically changes its economic system, he changes its IA, and it's regaining some of its momentum. Nowhere close to what the Emperor did, but a little bit. But he recognizes, if he didn't already intend to coup the alliance, he recognized that Six and the current leadership wasn't really going to be able to take it forward, and that they needed his vision. So he teamed up with a few other players and he couped the alliance. But not understanding, I think, the full makeup of the alliance, most of the players were, how do I put this, very unwise. They were not very educated in the game. And because that's the sort of community you need to cultivate to be able to tax farm them. So they were very uninformed, and they really didn't view him as a leader, they viewed him more as an invader. Particularly because a lot of Six's friends were in the alliance at this point. Like almost half the alliance was basically his friends in real life. But yeah, so Dusty takes over. The alliance loses half of its score again, but it has this leader that could be leading it right up the ladder again. So in some people's view, Dusty finally destroyed the alliance because he led the final set of coups, I would say. Or he started the final set of coups that would destroy it. But ultimately, how do I put it? If Dusty was destroying it at that point, he was destroying a ghost of an alliance. Like, it was nothing like it was. So could he really be blamed? It's debatable, right? So one of the other leaders, however, or one of the other... I'm trying to think of the right word. But one of the other assistants in this final coup was a little known character, small one. You know, he's only been in a few PNW stories. Epimetheus, who was basically going around small alliances and trying to find members for Camelot at the time, and for Rose, to a lesser extent. And so he joins Pantheon under Dusty, and he helps them rebuild, I think, the internal affairs. He redoes all the art. It's so weird to talk in the third person. Anyway, I help out, and then I report back to my overlords in Camelot and Rose, and I say, what am I to do now? Because I actually want to give this alliance a protectorate and help it out, because I think Dusty has the potential to lead it in a good way, right, and to recover it. Or if not him, one of the people that are here. Ideally, we could make it a democracy or something. But the overlords come back and say, no, you don't. We don't like Pantheon at all. We're going to cancel the treaty that was sent in-game erroneously between Camelot and Pantheon, and your new orders are to coup the alliance and destroy it. So that was an interesting one. So then we have another two candidates for who destroyed the alliance. One of them being me, because I got all the flack for it publicly, for like cooing Dusty and then taking over, and then most of the members left at that point, and those that didn't leave I kicked, because I didn't really want them to like be in this shell alliance. And the other candidate is George and Rose elements, because they were the ones that said nuke it. So those are more candidates. But at that point, again, keep in mind, Pantheon was such a shell of itself, like especially after the Dusty coup. Like the legitimacy was gone. Who really destroyed it at that point? Because Six has also been poaching ruthlessly from it under Dusty. So he's also another candidate in that way, because perhaps by siphoning all the members out, he was sort of condemning it to destruction anyway. That even if I hadn't sort of taken over at the end and tried to democratize it, then how do I put it? Then Dusty wouldn't have had any members to continue, and at being the type of player that he is, he would have moved on, and so the alliance would have died there as well. So you have a bunch of candidates in that pool in the final days, but the alliance isn't destroyed. The alliance still exists in game because I couldn't bring myself to destroy a piece of PNW history. Then I tried to give the alliance away. I tried to sell it to the Immortals, which didn't work, and then I tried to... Oh, and then I just gave it away to a player named Inst, who was rather famous in the game because he spent like $10,000 buying Pantheon credits during the Great Sock War, which was that war that Roar fought against Nova Riata and the Federation, that preemptive war. So it goes to Inst, who plans to be sort of the grave keeper of Pantheon, and sort of turn it into a tombstone for all the players that actually cared about it, which is kind of cool, and I think is very nice. But when he quit, then it went to the Immortals. So you have Inst, I think, / the Immortals as sort of the final candidates for the people that destroyed Pantheon, because although this memorial wall is very nice, unfortunately, it is also impeding the recreation of the Alliance, because whilst this is here, no one could ever recreate it. So in some ways, or in our way, then they are the final people that destroyed Pantheon, because they are the people that are impeding it. Unless, of course, you consider the Immortals the successor to Pantheon, which is kind of my view. They're an extremely similar alliance, not just in their flag design, which is sort of an inversion of each other. With these pointing out. Well, I know this is just the Macedonian flag, but it's, yeah, they're pointing out. And then the Immortals flag, which is all pointing in. Yeah, very similar. The ranks are also very similar. I think they might have changed. Yeah, they erased those, but Pantheon's ranks were very similar as well. Champion, Olympians, Titans, Primordials, Cosmic Lords, etc. They're both a yellow alliance, so Pantheon sort of handed off its color block to the Immortals. And in terms of ethos, I think the Immortals is more refined and more militaristic than Pantheon ever was, but in some ways they're very similar. They're not exactly the type to love war. And I think they're both relatively low-tax alliances. I think Pantheon was lower tax than the Immortals is, but it will never be a high-tax alliance. And Pantheon tried to maintain that ethos until 6. So that brings us back. Is there anyone that I missed? I'm trying to think. I don't think I've missed anyone so far. Let's answer some questions, if anyone has any. Pantheon had nothing to do with Romans. Pantheon was based on, well, being very vague about it, Pantheon was based on the Greek, like, Pantheon, right? Like the Olympians and Zeus and all of that, right? Where a character like Epimetheus destroying the Alliance would be really kind of poetic, because Epimetheus is a Greek name. But anyway, it should be called that. But I think Pantheon was also vaguer because the idea of Pantheon was that it wasn't like you have a Greek Pantheon, you have an Egyptian sort of Pantheon, Roman Pantheon, basically the Greek Pantheon, and the Nordic stuff as well. So Pantheon was meant to be this Greek alliance, but also an umbrella alliance, which, if you look at like Rose, Syndicate, Guardian, these are alliances that have a core theme of what they are, and then it's sort of an umbrella theme as well, that their name has a specific meaning and then a broader meaning. And so Pantheon allowed them to capture that sort of Greek identity, but then also a broader identity encapsulating even the Egyptian stuff, which the Immortals now uses. And that sort of carries through because the Immortals, instead of naming their leaders, for example, I'm completely blanking on Persia. They could, instead of naming their high government like satraps or whatever, it would be like the leaders of like the Persian Empire or local leaders. Then they didn't, right? They named them celestials, primordial. Those aren't exactly like those are way sort of vaguer notions. I don't think they're as neatly tied into Egyptian theology or mythology and what's it called or Persian history. So it's a vaguer theme. A pantheon wasn't neatly based off Macedon, even though they used the flag, because if it was based on Macedonia, then it would you would have like a king as the leader, but they didn't. They had I'm trying to remember what the pantheon had a titan as king, which is also sort of a weird sort of inversion, right? Where you have the Olympians are below the titans. So if you actually thought about Pantheon seriously for 2 minutes, you'd actually realize that it is based on the Greek religion prior to the war between the Olympians and the Titans, because the Titans are still in power. But anyway, just going into it a bit. I know Pantheon is really cool. Unfortunately, all the Greek-themed alliances have ended terribly. Be that Sparta, Atlas, Athens, and a few others. All of them have failed in spectacular fashion and been very entertaining as they do it. Oh, that it was. Yes, no, it was. It was called the was it called the Golden Age, or was it called? It's Golden something. You're right. Can there be a realistic successor? In my view, I think it is Pantheon. I think the only thing that's lacking from not Pantheon, the Immortals. The only thing that separates the Immortals and Pantheon, like seriously, is the lack of the Emperor. Like if the Emperor came back right now and said the Immortals is its rightful successor, legitimate successor, then it would be 100%, in my view. But arguably, you would also need the input of Sphinx or the TCW people, though there's not many of the Pantheon TCW people left. So if you wanted to unite all the people, unite all the pieces, you would need Yui and the Emperor. But if you just wanted, I think, in the bare minimum to make it like a perfect successor, I would say the Emperor. No, that'd be cool. They have finally a Greek themed alliance that does well. But let's see. It'll be interesting to see if I missed anyone as like candidates for who destroyed this thing, because it is really a story where you can talk to anyone in the game and they will give you a different answer. Like for example, Black Knights, who I didn't put Meliage up here. I'll try and fix that now. And I'm spelling his name wrong, I'm sure. Because when Meliage couped the Alliance, I don't think he informed Black Knights fully. I think he asked them if they would give him a protectorate, and then he couped, and they did not realize the full ramifications. But there were people in like the Syndicate and Pantheon, or former Pantheon people that didn't believe that, and that believed BK was responsible for the whole thing. Which, I mean, I don't know definitively what the answer is. So it could be there another candidate here that I'm missing entirely. It could also be there's like conspiracies about like MPO or Rose, or all these other sorts of side characters. The number of beefs that what's his face Fist has is extensive. It fills a whole wiki page, which I'm very grateful for because it is a very entertaining read. I didn't comment on Don Juan or some of these other side characters, which is a bit interesting. The Overlords. The Overlords are an interesting one. Were they responsible? I think it would be a mistake of me to make the argument that they were or weren't. Fist is the king of the pirates. Is he? Is he in ARG now? That'd be kind of cool. I know he's still bouncing around somewhere. It'd be a very interesting interview if I did one. Um, hmm. Trying to think. Well, let's also talk about instead of just who destroyed the alliance, let's think about trends and stuff that sort of contributed to the alliance imploding. So, okay, that's terrible. How do I shrink that? Okay, I don't know how to shrink that. Whatever. Then we have the mechanical changes. We have the decline of neutrality. We have the rise of militarism in PNW. And high taxes would be another one. And then maybe consolidation of high tier. And then the decline of Cindersphere as well. These are just the few notes that I'll talk about a bit because they're all really interesting. If we think about how the alliance was created, and I just realized the mini-me is not on the page. Let's try and bring him up. Yay, I'm back. So yeah, here. Let's talk about each of these. Can you see the rest now? I hope so. Anyway, so the mechanical changes. The game changed a lot since like Pantheon had formed, and even like since it's been destroyed. The market change was really rough on Pantheon because before then Wales used to be able to produce like 4 manufactured at a time. And so those changes negatively impacted Pantheon because the economic it shifted in such a way that the whales needed sort of longer peace periods between fighting. At least that was the perception. And even though those should benefit Pantheon, they kind of didn't. Yeah, so that's one element. The decline of neutrality is another. So Pantheon was the successor alliance to the GPA, and it relied on, especially at its height, ODPs and MDPs. And Thalmor is quite famous because when he was leader of Knights Templar, it was an ally to Pantheon, which was a giant neutral and pacifist alliance. It's quite comical, actually, if you think about it. Knights Templar, they're bloodthirsty fighters in PNW, amongst many other less generous characterizations. Were allied to these like purple elephant, Greek pacifist alliance, where there's just chilling and relaxing in a community. They were allied to a giant rose, but 10 times more peaceful and 10 times less competent. So that's very comical, but Thalmor messed up this treaty by telling a pirate to nuke Pantheon because it would be funny, or saying that they would be funny if they got nuked, and that's how it got cut. So Pantheon was very sensitive to slights, and it was also had very weak treaties, but it only needed like weak treaties because it wanted to stay out of wars. And over time, more and more of those neutral powers had to be dragged in, and the alliances like GPA and Pantheon that sat out and grew forever, like murking them was not enough. The hegemons would come after them and try and destroy them if they would not follow. So that was a big factor as well. And the rise of militarism is somewhat related, where the requirements for how competent your members had to be dramatically increased over time. Everyone had to be on Discord, and everyone had to show up for Blitz and all this other stuff. And Pantheon, as a farming alliance, was not all that good at that. And even under the Emperor, where they had much more skill, they were very low tier, so they weren't able to do as much. And it's possible that their activity would have fallen off over time, as most alliances do. So the rise of militarism really didn't help them, and the decline of neutrality didn't help them either. High taxes is another one, where in the early days of PNW, the largest nations, which were the nations which made you powerful, were accrued through internal or sort of external loans, where the bigger players would loan money to the smaller ones, and then they would earn interest off that, and then they would become like supermassive nations. Because in essence, you would have the largest nations at the top applying a 2 to 3% tax, or actually interest back then was like 5%. So it'd be like a 5% tax on the lower tier for funding the whale's growth. And then the whales weren't taxed at all. So the high tax alliances, stuff like MPO, BK, these proved that the way to catch up was through high taxes. And it led to a lot of newer players realizing, why should we join Pantheon where we will be stuck, like, basically paying this fee to the whales versus joining one of these fast tiering alliances, or alliances like Rose and TKR and TS, which would offer no interest loans to grow. So high taxes really hurt Pantheon sort of indirectly by making them less competitive than they were for new people. The consolidation of the high tier is another one, because simultaneously, whilst the high tax alliances were proving themselves, so were the whale alliances where you only had whales, where there were no small nations. Because in those alliances, you really didn't need to audit. There was like much less sort of noobish questions. There was a better culture and community in the eyes of those players. The age range was also like wildly different. I think Pantheon averaged like 20, and then the whales in that alliance were like 30. And then if you looked at the whale alliances, like the average was like 35, right? So they didn't really want to be in these sort of mass member alliances as much. And so yeah, as the consolidation of the high tier happened, then Pantheon also lost whales. And in some ways, you can view the UE merger into TCW as a continuation of that, where Pantheon didn't feel like it was strong enough by itself, and that its whales were joining TCW so they would have enough whales to be like a real competitor versus the other whale alliances of the day. So yeah, that's one element. And then you have the end of hegemony. Or hegemony, where, what's it called? Syndicate had basically established from 2016 to 2017? It was like 2 or 3 years. Anyway, yeah, 2016, 2018, I guess. For 2 years or longer. Might have even been 2015. Okay, 2015, 2018. 3 years, we'll say. I'm guessing at this point. They basically established this hegemony where they had all the military and political power, and their opponent was really, really weak and kind of split up and didn't trust each other. And it was in that atmosphere that Pantheon was born and grew really rapidly, that it grew under the umbrella of Syndicate's supremacy. And then when Syndicate lost that power, or it abdicated that power, and their hegemony ended, that was when Pantheon lost all of its security, and it lost all of its power and protection. And political protection as well, not just military. So it was only when Pantheon sort of had to stand on its own 2 feet, or almost stand alone, that they fell apart. And again, when they finally fell apart under, like when they lost the TS treaty and then they lost like 100,000 score in a week, that is sort of another element of it, right? Where they lost that protection from the Syndicate. The Pantheon might have been only a great power in times where their sphere was doing exceptionally well. And that if you supplanted TS with any other alliance in that position, maybe Pantheon would have done the same. But let's see what other questions people have. Yeah, I think new alliances right now are facing really like bad odds. I'm not quite as pessimistic as I was before. I think the new updates have helped the game a lot, but it's still very rough. You know, you kind of need mergers to be competitive. And yeah, splits and pirates are not helping. What else though? Is there anything else we could attribute to the destruction of Pantheon. I'm trying to think. What about you guys? How do you think Pantheon was destroyed? I don't know how many viewers I have, but it's probably a couple. Because it's interesting to see what people's beliefs are, because it sort of differs from person to person. No? Unlucky. It seems that is it. I'm gonna try and check on this other end. Okay. So that's it. So this was fun. Politics and War Unsolved. Trying to resolve one of the most disputed and debated issues in PNW history. From a sort of a almost lesser known alliance now. Funny to think that they were very important in their heyday. At least not necessarily as like a great power, but as a piece of constant entertainment. But yeah. Maybe we'll do another one of these if there are some more outstanding unsolved mysteries in PNW. Actually, I don't think I can say that for copyright reasons or whatever. Unsolved political disputes. What? Cool. Yeah, so we'll end it here. Hope you enjoyed.